It's another edition of Getting to Know Seahawks Twitter, and this time I have the pleasure of being joined by one Michael-Shawn Dugar. He writes about the Seahawks for The Athletic Seattle. He hosts the Seahawks Man-to-Man podcast. Mike, what's going on, man?
What is up? What is up? Happy to be here. Let's get it.
What have you been drinking since the Russ apocalypse began? Because I know you tweet from time to time, man, I'm going to need another one. Man, I'm going to need another one. And honestly, I feel the same way because this seems like this is going to be quite the long off season.
Oh man, I wish I had the bottle near me. It's a cognac. I'm a big cognac guy. It's like a Decorte. Is it VSOP? It's a good cognac though. I get it at Total Wine. I live right by the nearest Total Wine.
Oh, perfect.
Yeah, I live like 5 minutes from Total Wine. It's very, very great. Yeah, this shows you how much Seahawks like Twitter. Actually, this is like a little bit of a family. Like I've been tweeting so much about drinking every time there's a Russ rumor that people are like, Mike, we're worried about you. Like you gotta pace yourself, man. You're not gonna have a liver. It's like legit concern. I'm like, thank you. That's all right.
Yeah,
I'll get there.
That's awesome that you're right next to one too. I actually went for the first time to a Seattle liquor store and I purchased some myself because I felt the same way on Friday. And then I forgot. I learned the hard way that wow, there are some impressive liquor taxes in this state.
Yeah, no, for real.
It was a lot extra, but anyway, that's neither here nor there. I was listening to the latest episode of the Seahawks Man-to-Man podcast, and early on you said that you have two rules for rumors. It's true or someone wants us to believe it's true. And with Russell Wilson, we have been hearing both from Russell Wilson. We have been hearing through Russell Wilson's camp. I've been calling it his cult. What is going on right now? What's true? What isn't? If you could put a percentage to both, where would you put him at?
I guess I want to explain also why, before I answer that, why I've been like drinking. Not because anyone's right or anyone's wrong. Like that is very important here. It's because I know those two rules. Like either like everything Colin Cowherd and Nick Wright and Brandon Marshall and Dan Patrick say, either it's 100% right or someone 100% wants us to believe it. And it's just like, once that starts happening, I mean, you've been in this business for a long time too. Once the rumors start to go and the leaks go and it's the offseason and everyone needs to fill time, like they blame it on just the media. It's like, man, it sounds like Russ needs to fill some time too. Once that starts happening though, it really doesn't stop. It doesn't stop until people get back on the field again. And I was like, man, that is really going to be frustrating for all us local guys. Because if you notice, ain't nobody local leaking a damn thing. You know, it's national people who have connections. And then what do they never answer for it. So it's like if Cowherd goes on a spiel, right or wrong, for 3 minutes, it's like, Mike, what does this mean? I don't know. Ask Colin. Like he's the one clearly with the insights. Like, why? And then my people at the Athletic, my editors don't force me to write about any of this stuff, but there is this expectation, like, so there's something in Seahawks. We got a Seahawks guy. Maybe he should write about this. It's like, guys. Colin said all of that. I didn't report anything. Like, I don't. Now I got to get up stop my heist movie marathon, and go. Chase down something that Colin said or Brandon Marshall or Nick Wright or Jason Lockenfor, like all these people. It's like, go ask them. Like, I don't know. I don't have the answers. I'm not in Russell's camp. I'm sure it pays well to be in the camp, but I'm not in it. But I think to answer the what's going on, I think the best way to put it is Russ is really upset. And I talked about this on the podcast too, and I'm a victim of this as well. You don't think Russ is upset because he's smiling. You know, he doesn't go full on frown and pout and throw a tantrum. Like when he's frustrated, he legit said he was frustrated with a smile. Like I was on Zoom with him with the Walter Payton Man of the Year award, and I think Greg Bell asked, "How are you frustrated with the Seahawks?" And he laughs like, "Yeah, I'm frustrated with getting hit." I'm like, why are you smiling about Aaron Donald hitting you in the face? You know, like that's not something I would smile about. But it basically like cushions the blow a little bit, you know. But if he was like, "Man, I'm frustrated, dog," and he'd be like, "Oh, okay, it's real." But I've learned to interpret it the other way. Like, no, even if he says it with a smile, it's very, very upset. And I made this point to my co-host Chris Kidd on the podcast too. When someone asks for more control of something that you have control over, they no longer trust you with that control. You know, I made the analogy to him, like Chris edits our podcast. If I go to Chris, say, "Hey, Chris, I want to have more control over the editing of the podcast." Chris is going to assume that I am not okay with how he edits the podcast. Even if I say it with a smile, I still want more control over the editing because I don't like how you edit. Right? It's the same thing. Hey, I want more control over the offense or the personnel. Even if I say it with a smile, right? I'm still very upset with how you control the personnel, right? So it's reading between those lines of Russ has been kind of fascinating too. It's like he's implying the O-line is bad and the people in charge of getting him an O-line are bad at their jobs. He's just doing it with a smile, but I've decided he is actually very, very, very angry.
Very angry. Why now very angry? Because I get it. I mean, he's been hit a lot. And if you watch the Super Bowl, Tom Brady didn't get hit a lot, but Tom Brady's never been one to really hold the football in the pocket a while. Patrick Mahomes, meanwhile, it's clear that this is a guy that, like Russ, has made a lot of his plays by moving on the run. And there have been times where he runs outside the pocket. And if I've always felt like it's like watching Vladimir Putin play hockey against a bunch of his countrymen. Like almost no one wants to touch him for some reason. He's able to glide through these defenses. But this season, I felt like the offensive line made some progress. Not a lot, not nearly enough. And obviously Russ was sacked 40-plus times. It just feels timing-wise for it to happen this offseason. What is it that Russ is not feeling? What is it that Russ is angry about now that maybe he wasn't angry about last year or the year before?
So I think he was angry last year, too. He was, again, doing it with a smile. What did he say last year? Someone for the first time last year, this was really interesting, too. And I'm not, like, breaking any news here, but you think about it. Russ, for the first time, I think in his career, he got asked, hey, do you guys have enough to win a Super Bowl? And he said no. I think it was at the Pro Bowl. I can't remember who asked him. Maybe Diana Rossini. Someone had to check that for me. But he got asked, like, hey, do you have enough? And we're like, no, we need more. We need more sounds a lot better than no, but it's still no.
Right.
Right? It's a guy saying, do you guys have enough to get where you want to be? No. And he wasn't talking about himself. It's like, we got me. That's, step one. Like that's not like you say it with a smile, you do it at the Pro Bowl and you're in Orlando or whatever. You don't look angry, but like that comes from a place of unhappiness at the very least if you're not angry. So it felt like the breadcrumbs are kind of there, and this is not me like talking to Russ or doing any hard hitting journalism on that. It's just like, no, he said it's on YouTube.
Right. It's been all out of the open
enough and he says no.
It started, I remember which interview you're talking about. I don't know if it was with Pro Football Talk or what, but you're right. It was on YouTube. I think it was he also asked for superstars. And if you take a look at over the past year, the calendar's progressed to he had advocated for cooking more. And he had also somewhat advocated without actually saying bring him aboard, but Antonio Brown. And then multiple times of whether it was last offseason or now this offseason talking about the pace on offense. So you've been hearing a lot of the same things. I'm guessing, and you guessed this too on your podcast, Seahawks Man to Man podcast, that the talks have happened, but the talks probably haven't gone so well.
Yeah, and then that's not me doing a bunch of hard hitting reporting on this. It really is just like it's common sense. Sure, has Russell ran this stuff by Pete? Yeah, I'm sure he has. He has to run it by us now because it's not going well. Like I can only, that's just, again, I'm just connecting a dot. Like if he went to Pete and was like, hey man, I'm getting hit a lot, can we fix this? And he was like, yeah, sure. There'd be no need to go on a Dan Patrick show and say how many times you're getting hit. How many times you heard the number 394 in the past week, right? It's getting said like a cult. Like you said, it's a cult saying. Like, yeah, 394. So I don't think we can just assume that because you talk to someone, it goes well. That's not how that works at all. You guys can talk and get nowhere, which is what it sounds like, at least just watching. Again, you can piece together all of old quotes and interviews and the current stuff, and you can get a conclusion. You don't need to pick up the phone or call anybody, to be honest, or DM anyone or do any texting. You can just listen to Russell, look at the quotes, look at the subtle ways that like Pete Carroll says, yeah, I'm cool winning 17-14. And then Russ, like 4 days later, is like, well, I'm cool scoring 24 in the first half. Oh, it's not a surprise that those two particular people don't, see eye to eye. So I think the timing, the why now is a question I asked myself too earlier. Then I really sat down, probably with some of that cognac, and was like, is it out of the normal? And the answer was no. It's like there's been breadcrumbs here for a minute, and right now we're just kind of seeing it bubble up, on TV.
I talked about this with Danny this morning on the show, and we've seen a lot recently. Facts don't care about your feelings, but also feelings don't really care about facts. You feel a certain way about something, and it's going to be really hard for someone to shift your opinion on it because that's just how you feel. You might have someone actually explain it to you, like with a list. Hey, actually, what you're saying isn't right here. With Russ, there's a list, and I mean, you're hearing it through Colin Cowherd. The Seahawks have a 1980s offense. Pete Carroll has too much power. Russell Wilson wants more input. And then there's been other things too. And I've had a hard time with this one, Mike, where it comes to the way that the offense finished out the season. Because there's definitely an element of where Russ felt a little bit more gun-shy than he perhaps had earlier in the year. But if you take a look back at the amount of times that they threw the football versus the amount of times that they ran the football, you would think that, and you had a piece about Chris Carson this week about whether or not he'll be back. And we'll get to Chris Carson later, but his usage rate was like pretty low this past season. And then you look at with Russ as far as throws and attempted throws and all of that, if you add up the sacks, the throwing attempts, and the amount of times that he's ran the ball, and I'd imagine there might have been some designed runs out there along the way, but for the most part, it's him scrambling. And over the last 9 games of the year, it was basically 41 calls that were some sort of a pass or where Russ is getting the ball first and he's not handing it off to anybody, to 21 handoffs. And I saw that and I was like, okay, well, we've been hearing the offense is conservative a lot, and Russ is frustrated with it. From at least a pass to throw, a throwing to running standpoint, it didn't really feel that way. So I guess that's my first issue with maybe Russ and his issues with the offense. What do you feel about that?
Yeah, that's the thing that I've fortunately really tried to avoid, is litigating the merit of his claims, because you as you can see, you get lost in this numbers and then you dial into the film. I think I mentioned this on the podcast. There was a player had texted me because I asked about the Russ thing. I was like, "What do you think?" And he said, "You know what you should do is you should go through each sack, right, and tweet the clips and just let the people decide the stuff." And I was like, man, that's a lot of work. It's a lot of sacks. Someone did it on Twitter.
Parker Lewis put it out there on Twitter, yes. and fast forward. And you know what? Thank you, Parker, because he got through it pretty quickly that way.
Right. Yeah, I did see that. I would have liked to see the all 22 angles on that to really glean anything, but it doesn't even matter. I was like, that's just a lot of work. Good for him. But it really, what I got to was the relationship part of it. It was more like, it doesn't really matter. Like you said, facts and feelings. Russ thinks he's right. Right, that whether he's to blame for some of those 394 sacks, how many of them he's to blame for, whatever, he thinks he's right. And when you have a coach who doesn't really invest in the O-line that well, they do it, just not that well, and who prefers to run the ball so you're not getting sacked, I can just see how he probably thinks he's right as well. Like, I can imagine that. I don't have to, again, pick up the phone, call nobody. That's just pretty simple. Like, Russ thinks he's right. I imagine if he goes and beeps with Dwayne Brown or Mike Solari or Pete Carroll or John Snyder, they're like, dude, you're to blame here too a little bit. There's that clip of Dwayne Brown in the Vikings game and Russ takes the sack, and Dwayne Brown's like, he looks so disappointed. He's like, Russ, stay back there. You're good. Stay there for me, please. Because who got credited for a sack on that play is Dwayne Brown. Yeah. So there's plenty of people who could rebuttal. I could rebuttal all of Russ's points. If he called me right now and said, Mike, what do you think about, 394 sack thing? I'd be like, well, let's talk about it. Like, we could do it for an hour or 2 hours or whatever. But to me, the more interesting thing is, like, if he thinks he's right, front office thinks they're right about how they've assembled O-linemen or Russ's role in creating sacks. Okay, then the next step forward isn't necessarily, what is the next step forward? I don't know what it is. Yeah. Is it convincing one of the parties that they're wrong? Is it removing one of the parties from the equation? Like, that's the next step. Because when you get to this point where Russ is like, nah, I'm going to throw this 394 sack number out here like it's religion, I don't think you're not convincing him that he's wrong. It's not even really worth doing. Shout out to Parker for doing that, with the clips, but I'm just not going to do it because I don't think we're going to get anywhere. We're trying to find a solution. You got to go to the people who think they're right and figure out whether they can still coexist.
You heard from him too on Dan Patrick. He was asked about the sacks. He acknowledged that he took part in some of the sacks, but he also said, well, some of those plays that aren't sacks turn into touchdown passes, which, to his point, is fair. Maybe not as fair as it would have been a couple of years ago. I think we're seeing some signs of decline as far as Russ's escapability, but I mean, he's still very elusive, very mobile. You and Christopher on the podcast made a comparison about the issue being sort of like similar, a difference in opinion on pizza. And you were talking about pineapple on pizza, which, by the way, it's not pretty good. I had to be convinced by a girl to actually try. It's pretty good. It doesn't seem like it would work, but it actually does. If you haven't tried it, at least try it before you actually have the opinion. But when there's two differing opinions that are just as subjective as that, how do you bridge the gap? I mean, do the Seahawks need to acknowledge this publicly? Because clearly Russ has made his feelings known, not just to them privately, which I assume happened, but also now he's doing it on a tour that has ranged from Dan Patrick, maybe less on the GQ, but and of course on that Zoom session with you guys.
Yeah, that's the other really like tricky part, because I'm not really. I don't want to make this sound bad because we haven't really met him yet. It's Shane Waldron. I saw he got hired, and I was like, okay, cool. You know, like if people are really optimistic about it, I can understand. That's fine. If I think the problem is a relationship thing, I don't think changing the schemer matters. You know, like Pete said, he adjusted the offense after the Buffalo game, and that changed things, right? What did Russ first say on, I think there was a CBS interview. It's like, what happened? DK said you guys got figured out. What do you think? And he was like, well, we started to run the ball a lot more, ... Like, that's all I needed right there. I don't think me, you, Shane Waldron, Andy Reid, Eric Bieniemy, I don't think anybody, if the problem is we don't believe in the same things, then it doesn't matter who's the genius behind it. You know, everyone in the NFL is running the same stuff. It's all the same concepts, you know, with the same similar blocking schemes. No one's that creative for the most part, right? Ain't nobody out here running the wishbone,
right?
While everyone else is just throwing it. You know, and no one's running the air raid, like, you know, we were doing at Wazoo. Like, there's only so much. It's all about who you are, what you believe. So until I don't really think there's a natural change for that. Although I did talk to someone about this. This is the one time I did pick up the phone. Someone did mention, I was like, man, how do we fix this? Not we, I'm not in it, but if I was, I need a raise. But like, how do they fix this? And the only word that came up was like accountability. Everybody's got to look in there and hold each other accountable. Like, let's get on the same page. Let's understand where we're at fault and how we can move forward. And I don't. That's, you want to talk about accountability and relationships. That doesn't always end well.
The funny thing is, though, it doesn't seem like it's that hard. I mean, it's about egos, right? It's a Schmenzer swinging competition where people don't really want to admit that they're wrong. But, you know, if both parties are wrong, both parties should be able to sit down and say, yeah, here's what I could do better. The other person says, here's what I could do better. And yet that feels like it's something that's not likely to happen.
Yeah, well, the other problem is the difference between like a relationship between anyone, you know, man, woman, woman, is that you're equal in it, in theory. Like, no one has more control over the relationship than the other person. Whereas, like, if you go boss to worker or labor to management in any field, the boss is inherently more powerful. So, like, we can't naturally come to an agreement if we can't even we're not even on the same page in terms of authority. And so I think that's a really interesting part about the Seahawks dynamic, or any coach who also has personnel control. I think Rivera is getting something similar in Washington. Bill Belichick has it. Pete has it. Colin Cowherd mentioned something about this in one of those monologues as well. Like, that is an interesting part. We can't come to agreement like, let's look in the mirror and hold each other equally accountable if we are not on equal footing within the organization. Like, Russ makes more than like Pete Carroll, for example, or whoever the Washington quarterback is will make more than Ron Rivera. But at the end of the day, I can fire you. Yeah, you know, like, this ain't the NBA. Like, player can't fire the coach. So I don't really know how they can even have that level of accountability if they're not starting on equal footing.
We're going down a hypothetical road here, but I like it. I think something's changing in the NFL, and I might be reading too much into it, but I have always wondered when quarterbacks will start feeling as powerful as those players in the NBA who you just sort of talked about, how they had the power to fire a coach. Because, you know, yeah, a coach might have the power to fire a quarterback, but why would he do it? And how would he justify it? And I mean, we're seeing essentially Houston right now lose its mind over what's going on with Deshaun Watson, where it feels like they're fine with the quarterback quitting and are essentially telling him, all right, well, I mean, you're going to be back. But if he actually sits out, I wonder if that's a domino that creates other quarterbacks saying, you know what? I mean, if this ain't working for me, I'm going to sit. It's a little different because that's just a giant mess of an organization. I covered it just 2 years ago, and it's amazing like how little is still left from just 2 years ago. But I do wonder if that's going to change. What do you think about that?
I've thought about that a lot, actually. It's like almost like quarterback empowerment, because they are like disproportionately more powerful than everyone else on the roster. And they are an extension of management, and in a lot of ways, because they are, like I said, more powerful than everyone else. Like if the quarterback doesn't like something or someone, it behooves the organization to just get the other dude out the paint, right? Like chances are he's not more important than you. Even if you could take a really like valuable relationship, I want to say like who's significantly better than their quarterback. I would say like, let's say Justin Jefferson and Kirk Cousins, right? If Justin is better at his job than Kirk is at his job, but if Jefferson doesn't like Kirk, doesn't matter. If Kirk doesn't like Justin, we'll send you to Buffalo, right? Like that's just kind of how it works around there. That's what happened with Stephon Diggs and Kirk Cousins. I don't know if they didn't like each other, but the power dynamic there it could shift. Here's where I run into a problem if I'm the quarterbacks. Are you willing to go full Carson Palmer? Are you willing to go just, I'm done. I don't need this football stuff anymore? Because if I'm Houston, to use their example, man, Deshaun Watson calls me and I'm one of the McNair family men and I'm like, hey, man, I need a trade. It's like, all right, well, we got camp on the 31st. You coming? Well, yeah, I mean, I'm going to be there, but okay, then no trade. Right. Same thing with Russell. Like the only leverage you have is your presence, ultimately. And unless you're willing to use it, which is difficult because you're in a leadership position, it's different than if a safety skips camp. Like you safety, we got 5 of y'all, on the roster just naturally. Hey, man, Deshaun Watson out of camp. Like, what are we gonna do here? Like, we're gonna hire Josh McCown to be the coach and throw it?
Oh boy,
like that's like that. Yeah, there's a problem there. So I do think we're trending in that direction where quarterbacks will try and exercise that power, but I do think they're gonna hit a wall because they can't use the leverage they ultimately have, which is their presence.
And it's hard to buy into Deshaun Watson doing what Carson Palmer did, saying, "Yeah, I'm just gonna retire." Because of the career that he's had. I mean, he's only been in the NFL for a couple of years. It's not like he hasn't earned a bunch of money, but there's the same saying, hey, if I'm going to retire after 4 years just to prove a point, the way that's going to be looked, even if that's an unfair way to look at it, like 10 years from now, that's something that you can maybe call the bluff on. But with someone like Russ, who's been in the league for a while and who has earned a lot of money and who's earned a lot of cachet, even though it seems like it would be totally off brand for a guy that constantly is talking about his legacy, he might actually have that kind of sway should he, if we continue to go down this hypothetical road, decide, you know what, until I get what I want, I'm retiring.
Yeah, no, he's not doing that. Like, look how much Russ named his firstborn son Win. I know Future is his like stepson, but it's not his biological son, right? So it's essentially his firstborn son. He named him Win, right? That is an obsession with triumph that I'll never be able to like identify with. I just won't, right? And that's why these guys are just wired differently than me. But once you get to that point where you're so dedicated to this craft and winning that you would name your son after it, that I don't think you can ever really walk away, at this point. Like, look how angry he looked watching Tom Brady at the Super Bowl. Yeah. I don't just think it was just because he wasn't playing in the game. It was who was playing in the game. It was the guy he wants to be and the guy who surpassed him in a lot of eyes of other people in terms of the two quarterbacks. Like that, it means something, right? Like you're not going to walk away from that. Like if same thing with Houston and Deshaun. If Russ calls Pete and says, hey, man, I'm not going to show up to or hey, I'm going to want to trade. Well, we got OTAs on May 15th. You coming? Well, I mean, yeah, man, I love these guys and blah, blah. Okay, well, click. Like see you on the 15th. There's nothing any of these guys can do. It's like they would all the quarterbacks would have to unite on this, and they're not gonna.
Right.
It might be like Aaron Rodgers, Deshaun, and Russell Wilson all just on like a boat somewhere, like rebelling against their respective organizations. But then there's 29 other guys who are showing up to camp, so you guys really don't have any leverage.
I'm trying to imagine those guys on a banana boat or something like that. What would also be pretty funny? The guy to do it would have been Jay Cutler, right? I mean,
oh man, he looks like he doesn't care about anything.
He doesn't care about anything at all. I mean, he's the subject of a reality TV show. I actually forced myself to watch that show, and man, every single appearance by him, oh, it was so good. It was so good. I have a little bit of an obsession with reality TV. The Bachelor has been a lot of fun this season. So how's this thing going to end? And I asked this like really deep sounding question to Danny O'Neill this morning on the show because we were talking about, okay, well, the end is coming. And I was like, well, are you afraid of death? And he was like, yeah, so everyone's afraid of death. And I mean, all things come to an end. This is going to come to an end eventually. If we've learned anything from Tom Brady or Peyton Manning, I mean, the greatest quarterback organization relationships, they have a shelf life. So I guess the question is, how do you prolong this relationship? How do you stave off whatever prognosis a doctor might give? If it's, hey, yeah, you've got until 2021 to live, or you've got until 2023 to live. That's what I'm wondering. How this can, at the very least, be pushed down the road, the length of this relationship.
There is a simple answer, but one of my favorite like things on social media is like it's like a running joke where you say team legend and person who was there for like a hot second, like Seahawks legend Jerry Rice.
Yeah, that's my favorite.
Or like there's so many, like Johnny Unitas, I think, played for like a random team at the end of his career. Like Peyton Manning on the Broncos is relatively random. Brady on the Bucks. It's so in the NBA as well. Like I saw a picture of like Charles Barkley and like Scottie Pippen on the Rockets or something.
In the ugly Rockets uniforms. Yeah, the pinstripes.
Yeah, like things like that. And I think they're very funny, but they do illustrate that like you don't get the Dirk Nowitzki thing. You don't get the Tim Duncan. You don't get the Kobe Bryant thing. You don't get I guess this is technically Drew Brees' second team, but yeah, he's a Saints guy. No one sees him as a Charger really. You don't get that. That's very hard and it's very rare. And if Tom Brady doesn't get it, if Peyton Manning doesn't get it, like, I mean, Michael Jordan played for the Wizards. You know what I mean? Like, it's not, that's not real. Like, chasing that is very, 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 very hard. So I think as much as these guys want the Dirk thing, the Kobe, the Tim Duncan, like, there's a reason that those guys don't get it. But I think the short answer to how do you fix this thing is to win.
Yeah.
Right. That's it. I think that's the simplest way. And will they do it? I don't know. It's my job to act like I know football. I do a good job at the acting part. I don't know how much about the knowing football, because like I can tell you everything. I thought the Chiefs were going to blow them out, right? Like in the Super Bowl. So it's how much I know. But I think that's the only way. There's no roster move. There's no restructuring of a contract. There's no conversation, I don't think, because Pete and Russ have been together since 2012, right? Like if it's gotten to, it's only getting worse at this point, then it's not getting any better since they got in on this thing. So they got to win. That's the only thing they both really are always been aligned on. Pete's book in 2010 is called Win Forever. Russ's son's name is Win. They're always going to be aligned on that goal to win. And to get them on the same page, you got to do it. That's really all I got. Otherwise, we're going to see like 40-year-old Russ in a Jets jersey or something like that. Like Jets legend Russell. Yeah, no, it's just it doesn't mesh. But that's kind of how like we're trending here with like, yeah, Jets legend Russell Wilson.
Look, if he's going to force his way out, don't go to the Jets. Come on. I mean, they made their uniforms ugly now, too. Woody Johnson's back from England, ready to screw that organization up more than he already has. Come on. Anywhere else. I mean, even the Giants with that hard-o Joe Judge, that might even be a little bit better. The one thing that I can think of is, okay, well, maybe for the sake of spending big, you buy Russ a car, you get him some fancy toy in free agency, you get him some fancy toy on the offensive line and say, look, man, we're trying to make it work. Because this is the weirdest thing, and you and Christopher talked about this on the podcast, where it's hard for Russ to trust the way that the Seahawks have evaluated offensive linemen, regardless of how much they have actually tried to address that. And the biggest thing that they've done is they've traded for Dwayne Brown. But I mean, there's a lot of people that you could talk about along the way that they've signed, that they've drafted, and it just hasn't worked out.
Yeah, I mean, if Russ is not very different than Seahawks Twitter in that way. Like Seahawks Twitter's been dumping on the O-line and Pete Carroll and all these guys for years. And it's like, imagine being the guy getting hit because the O-line ain't good. You know, like independent of his role in it, like Russ is very similar to everyone else in that regard. He sees, you know, you give like, all right, I want more linemen, better linemen in the offseason. It's like, well, here's $7 million on Luke Jokel, right? Like everyone mocked that signing. And Russ is like, well, I got to work with this dude, you know, like that's, you know, Ode Ibushi, and they've drafted really poorly on the O-line from with their, in every round too. They've drafted bad 6-rounders, 2nd-rounders, 4th-rounders, 1st-rounders. They've just been bad at it all around. They won't spend big on it. Like the philosophical like belief of the organization is to not spend big in free agency. And I can agree with some of that. Like most of the time, if you spend big in free agency, you're overpaying for a good, not great guy. Like that's kind of how it works. But I think here's why I don't think that they'll ever come off of that. And this is really understanding Pete Carroll. Pete Carroll, the mistake that, well, not the mistake, what he learned a lot from getting fired and what he's learned from like John Wooden and other, influences in his life. I forget the name of the Vikings coach, Bud Grant.
There you go.
He's learned a lot from Walsh as well. Is you fail once you lose who you are. Like that's kind of where Pete. That's where Pete comes from on this. It's like as soon as you start chasing trends or deviating from your philosophy and who you are and what got you here, that's when you fail. It's not when you just do what you know and go down swinging, right? So that's kind of where Pete comes from. That's why I never thought he would let Russ cook, because that is what he believes. But at the same time, the counter argument is, well, he did let Russ cook. It's like, yeah, well, he gave it 8 games, right? Like that was it. He didn't even give it a full year. He was like, after Buffalo, it's a long flight. My mind is changing. So if that's so, Pete would have to legit deviate from who he is and what he believes in his heart about how to go about winning forever. Could he? Sure. But I mean, what, 70, 69? Like, I don't know how many people at that age is changing anything about what they do.
Yeah, you're right on that. And man, the weird thing is, it really did feel like Russ was still cooking, but he was cooking like he had someone next to him holding his arms. Like maybe he was just so cautious about turning the football over. And I actually get it. If they told Russ, hey, calm down with the turnovers. I mean, there were 10 turnovers in 4 games, and it was just so uncharacteristic for Russ. You think of Russ, I mean, one of the reasons I always like to put Russ and Brady in the same conversation is because I think more than any quarterbacks over the last, 20 years, I feel like they've taken care of the football. They just don't turn the football over. And then that happened, and you sort of think to yourself, oh, well, what's going on here? And I see why Pete unplugged, but at the same time, I really want to know the depths of the unplugged, because they were throwing still, and they weren't running a whole lot.
No, it was still like a 59% early down pass rate from weeks 10 to 17, which covers the back 8 games of the season. Yeah, but that's why I think it was more, I gave the pizza analogy on my podcast. I think it was more like behind the scenes, like all we were doing as a fan base to continue or not a fan base, but observers necessarily, all we were doing and to continue the pizza analogy, we were walking in and seeing everyone eating and thinking, well, okay, cool. Everyone ate, right? Like no one's going to bed hungry, but we don't know how we got to the space of like where everyone's eating this Little Caesars, and we're like, well, Russ is in the corner, like, I don't really like this, like I'm eating it because it's here. But so I think that it's not just the fact that we walked in and saw everyone eating, right? I think that's where it got kind of tricky with the Seahawks. And again, it's a philosophical thing though. Pete is risk averse. Most defensive coaches kind of are. Like I think another good example is like Mike Zimmer. He's like a run first guy. Like he was a run first dude when he had Adam Thielen and Stephen Diggs. It's just like, what? It's the same thing people think of when they say, man, you want to run first with Tyler Lockett and DK?
Yeah.
Cool, I guess. It's very similar. Their defensive coaches are usually kind of naturally risk averse in that way, and they give the benefit of the doubt to running. So I think I gave this example on the podcast too. If Chris Carson were to come out in the 2019 season and fumble 5 times in 4 games, right, and lose all the fumbles, let's say loses all, Pete's still going to swear by running, right, because he gives the benefit of the doubt to running. Russ comes out here and throws 10 picks in 5 games. It's like, well, I don't give throwing the benefit of the doubt. I view it as inherently more dangerous than running it. And right or wrong, understanding that's how he thinks explains why after, like you said, 10 turnovers in 4 games, which led the league in that span from week 7 to 10, I think, something like that. Pete's like, yo, chill out. This is a 6-hour flight to Buffalo, home from Buffalo. We're going to talk. You ain't going to turn, or I think that's after the Rams game. He had 3 more or 4 more. But in general, like you could tell that was what made Pete upset, because he'll try anything. I actually legitimately believe, as much as I think he's kind of stubborn, he'll try anything unless it results in turning the ball over. Like that's it. If this results in turning the ball over, I'm going to suggest some type of change. The thing is what he's willing to give more of the benefit of the doubt to. And the benefit of the doubt for Pete Carroll goes to running the ball. But that doesn't necessarily mesh when you're paying your quarterback $140 million over 4 years.
No, not really. You've got me thinking on this. I don't know if Pete's one to play Cold War through the media, but at the end of the year, he did talk about how we'd like to run the football more effectively. And I wonder if maybe that's something that he was doing as his own, not necessarily passive aggressive, but just way of saying like, hey, this is how it's done here, Russ. This is how it's going to be done.
Well, that's the thing about Pete is, and I asked him about this too, and I don't know if I'll turn it into a story, but I do think his answers were very illuminating. I asked him about dealing with the media because Pete Carroll is probably the only coach in the NFL who is a celebrity. I would say like a legit celebrity, not just like you're the football coach in the city with his NFL team. Like you were legit, like people. John Gruden is probably the only other one who was like famous, legit famous. And that means a lot, right? That you have to deal with a lot of stuff, and you basically, I'm saying, you know how to work the media. You know your words matter. Choose them carefully. Even his end of the year thing, he kept reiterating. He could tell, like, oh, you guys are gonna run with this run thing. Okay, hold on, timeout. I'm not saying run it 50 times, guys. Let's just run it better with more focus than we did before. Like you could tell he knew what the narrative was going to be. He's always been aware of that, which is why his number one rule in his program is protect the team. Right? Don't say anything crazy. Protect it. Keep it in-house. We'll hold each other accountable on Monday behind closed doors. That's why it would kill him to be on like Hard Knocks. Right? Like, he'd be terrified if the Seahawks are on there because it's like, whoa. We're giving up state secrets here. We don't want that. So like I do read a lot into what Pete Carroll says. I know sometimes he just talks outside of his neck, like most people do. It's what happens when you do 5 media appearances a week or whatever, right?
Right.
But a lot of those end of the year joints, like he knows what we're gonna do, what we're gonna write, what we're gonna tweet, what we're gonna talk about. He knows all of that stuff, and he's trying to control it a little. And I would too if I was him. To be fair, I don't fault him for that, but yeah, it's not. You're not doing too much to like parse through his words and see if there's some like underlying meaning there, because there is, and he knows that that's the case. He knows that that's the last time he's going to talk to us until the draft. And it's 4 months. That's a lot of time for us to talk like we are now. He ain't said nothing since January 10th. And I've been talking about Pete every day for the past like 3 weeks.
And no NFL combine, so we're not going to hear from him for a lot longer too, which is also annoying. We want all this clarity right now. And the funny thing is, I mean, you know, when we have him on the show, I'll ask him questions, and he's like, "Oh, Paul, you're always so worried. Why are you so worried?" He does this great job of, I imagine anyone who's listening, they kind of listen to him, and you probably feel somewhat assuaged, if you will. But at the same time, man, yeah, you're right. And they both are. I mean, Russ is definitely pretty good at it too. And that's why you can see them maybe going back and forth on this. You wrote a piece about Chris Carson, and it doesn't sound like Chris Carson's going to be back here. It's a nice piece for The Athletic that you put together. And you started off talking about how Pete said, like, Chris Carson's a huge priority for them this offseason. But then you take a look at the way he was used this past year. They didn't use him a whole lot. So why do you think it's not going to end up being a reunion between the Seahawks and Chris Carson? Because I wonder what they're going to do if they don't have Carson as their number one running back.
Yeah, I think that's another like philosophical like thing. Like they just don't really pay running backs. I think Marshawn Lynch is the only running back in the Pete Carroll era that wasn't a draft pick to get a multi-year deal. And I say it wasn't a draft pick because they signed 4-year deals. Just that's how it works. I think everyone else has just been 1-year rentals and guys off the waiver wire like Mike Davis. It's just been really hard to get a deal. Not to say there's anyone who's been worth a deal necessarily in that span. We could argue like Mike Davis was worth at least 2 years. Like they didn't offer him anything, I don't think. But I think that's part of it, you know, as well. The penny factor. Like if you take a first round, that's the thing with like the politics of the NFL too. You take a guy in the first round, there's just pressure on him to succeed within the organization. There's pressure on the guys, the coaches who advocated for him in the room, the GM who advocated for him in the draft room, the scouts, the position coach. Like we need to nail this pick. Like they're all telling themselves that we got to nail this pick. So eventually you got to roll him out there. Or if you don't, if you go spend on Chris Carson, that's admitting failure. Like not to say you can't have a 1-2 punch, which is probably how they would spin it, you know, to control the narrative there. No, that's failure. If you can't enter year 4 of your first round picks contract without him being your full-time number one guy, whatever position, failure, right? That's just what it is. You would have to admit that. And I think that's part of this too, even though you can argue that it shouldn't be. You should just focus on the team, not nobody's freaking ego. But again, that's just, we're talking about a bunch of grown men with egos. The other part of it too is I think Chris's injury history is going to get used against him, which I understand. And the point I always try to make with the injuries is there's like a million reasons not to pay running backs, and the injuries are like reason 999,999, right? Like I just don't care about the injury history. I use Christian McCaffrey as an example in that piece. Had never missed a game, signed a $64 million deal, missed 13 games right away. You're like, it doesn't, your injury history is not entirely predictive. I know CJ Prosise burned a lot of Seahawk fans over the course of his career, but just in general, you can be perfectly fine and then boom, one play, you're done. Mitchell Schwartz in Kansas City, he never missed a game. Hurt his back and hasn't played since. Right, Richard Sherman here in Seattle didn't miss anything. Right, had that Achilles, Seattle was done with him. Right, so I think that's just a bad argument to use against running backs, but it will be used against Chris because that's how the game goes. Negotiations are ugly. They tell you things you don't want to hear. That's why they don't want players negotiating their own contracts. They be in there talking crazy. I'm like, man, look here. Your play dipped here, 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 and here. You did this. This dude over here coming out of Ohio State is just as good as you for a fraction of the cost. We could draft him. We just went to the Senior Bowl and saw this dude could replace him with that. And then you eventually settle on like a 2-year deal. And it's like, man, we talked crazy to each other. Are we good? You need that agent as the buffer there to fix that because they get in there and get disrespectful. So I think there's just so many factors that align with them not bringing Carson back. Not even that they don't have the money. I think the biggest thing is the investment in Rashad, the injury history that they will ultimately use against him. Again, that I think is a bad argument. And a little bit just the organizational view of the value of running backs. Like they've only paid Marshawn. They can be like, if you ain't Marshawn, get out. And that's just kind of how they've done it.
What's interesting about that is it was so bad when they didn't have either Chris or Marshawn. I mean, I think of 2017. Correct. I mean, it was a disaster. And I know that they've had guys who have had some brief little blips. You could say Thomas Rawls or others who you looked at it and you're like, oh, okay, that's nice. But there is a community on Twitter, and I perhaps am one of the few that stands up against it, though quietly because you get ganged up on so quickly on Twitter. But this idea that running backs don't matter, I have a hard time with it because I do think that there are maybe like 8, 9 in a given season, and it can change really quickly, whether it's due to injuries or a guy just losing it or not all of a sudden not being in the best scheme. But I do think that there are certain guys who stand apart, and Carson is one of those guys to me. And that's the tricky part. Like, are you willing to invest in a guy who has maybe played in 3/4 of the seasons that you've wanted him out there for? Can you stomach that when he's not going to be there for a couple of games? Can you deal with him being on the sidelines?
Yeah, the running backs don't matter thing has become like hyperbole that has gotten taken literally. Because like, I don't want to say that any other man does not matter. Like on a human level, I'm just not going to do that unless the man is wildly racist or something. Then I'm like, yeah, no, you don't. But for the most part in football, no. The other part is like, for me personally, we're talking about running backs are like 99.9% young black dudes. So I want all of them to get paid. Yeah. Right? I never don't want that part of this to get lost. I'll root for every player at every position, white or black, to get paid. But specifically, when we talk about running backs, I would never advocate for them to like take pay cuts or whatever. Go get as much money as you can because it's the only shot you got, right? Like especially like the GM who's giving you the money, that's not his money, right? That's not like John Snyder's not pulling his money out of his wallet to hand Chris, right? But that is real money to Chris, right? Like that's what he's going to live on and build generational wealth off of. So there is that. The other part of the thing, like running backs don't matter, has caught on as a phrase because it's a lot simpler than saying running backs don't control enough variables to warrant the salary that they would want to command relative to their value over replacement or something like this. So many, like I could explain it. Like for me, I tell people all the time, if I was running a team, I probably wouldn't pay any running back. Not Derrick Henry, not Kamara, not Christian McCaffrey. I would draft the next kid out of Ohio State or Bama every time I needed a running back. And most of the time I'd be fine relative to their fraction of the cost. I mean, Carolina wasn't a good example this year. They had Mike Davis, right? When Christian McCaffrey was out, the offense looked fine, right? You check the numbers and look at the cost. Mike Davis cost him like $2 million, I think maybe. Christian McCaffrey is averaging 16 a year.
Yeah.
There's been other examples too, but I think like that aspect of like the value over replacement. And I think running backs also, people forget, and I remind people on my podcast all the time, when you draft them, they're in their prime. The minute Roger Goodell says, with the whatever pick, Alvin Kamara, boom, prime. He is prime, peak physical state. He's the best value he'll ever be to the team in terms of finances. Right there, boom. No other position is like that.
Right.
Not linemen, not corner. Corners can be fine for a very long time. Their prime, Shaquille Griffin's prime could be now. He's 25. Carson's is probably a 1 year max, maybe left, because he was his prime in 2017. So like there's just all of these reasons not to spend big because of the value over replacement. Like if you're Green Bay right now, do you give Aaron Jones for $13 million a year, or do you trot out AJ Dillon? You know, he just drafted in the second round.
Those big thighs.
Like, is AJ Dillon better than Aaron Jones? No, but is he better relative to his cost? Yeah, his cap hit's probably 900,000 versus the 13 mil that you got to give Aaron Jones. Like, is he $13 million better than AJ Dillon? And that's where you get into the don't matter. But look how long-winded that was.
Yeah,
I could just say that running backs
does not roll off the tongue. And the funny thing is too, you know, the rookie wage scale killed running backs more than anyone. And it's funny because I've always thought that if you're going to pick someone in the first round, the odds of you hitting with a running back versus any other position, I would say they're somewhat higher. I don't have like the numbers or the data to necessarily back that up, but I feel like if you draft a running back early on, the guy's probably going to be good. The problem is the risk of, you know, the injuries and all those things that might take place. But unfortunately, those guys are getting, you know, set at a very menial level, especially the guys who are the 3rd round picks or a 7th round pick like Chris Carson. And you play 4 years, 5 years, all of a sudden that's it. And what did you get for it?
Right. I think, man, the NFL, I've read the CBA before, and it is not the whole thing. Like, Jesus, like a but
yeah, nerd.
I've read it. It's very, very complicated, right? And it's a lot of things that have been worked out, and structures and rules and exemptions. I think they should, if whoever created that, good God, that is a lot of work that they did. They could do something like what I would suggest is a pool of money or rules for non-quarterbacks. Just a separate. I think they tried to do that in the 90s, to be honest. Just non-quarterbacks, because they're just so different than everyone else. And then a separate thing for running backs. Like, there's got to be, because like you're saying, that they're just different than everyone else. And they're not to say they're a dime a dozen, because there are some great talents. There ain't a bunch of Derrick Henrys out there. But relative to the cost and the production and the value, it's just, there's no reason to do that. And then that's before even talking about how often they take hits, right? If you're a running back, the play isn't over until somebody hits you in the face. This is kind of generally, unless you score a touchdown, even then someone probably hits you on the way there. Right? I think as complicated as these guys do all these rules and how many lawyers they get involved for all of the stuff in the CBA, it shouldn't be that hard to like, okay, let's understand here. Positional value is different. Everyone shouldn't be on the same umbrella. Let's make a pool for quarterbacks. Let's give, you know, some type of exemptions for running backs, or let them negotiate different deals, or they can choose to go into, like, baseball has arbitration, something like that after a year or so. Like, let running backs be able to do something different, acknowledge that they're different. Yeah, it'd be like the rebuttal to that probably is like, man, Mike, that'd be a lot to figure out. Well, yeah, man, you read the CBA? Like, they figured out a lot of stuff in the CBA, man. If they can do that, they can figure out like how to make the game and the finance and the economics of this make a little bit more sense than they currently do.
Michael-Shawn, this has been a lot of fun. I have one last question before we end this, and I challenge everybody who comes on to think of this on the fly. You have one word to describe Seahawks Twitter. How would you do it in one word?
Oh man, that's tough. I'm a big vocab guy too. Let's see if I can think of something good on the fly.
Definitely can't be the running back explanation.
No, I wish I could. Like, I didn't know this before I answered. Fun fact: I did not know that. Shout out to Ben Baldwin, who writes for us at the Athletic too. It just does great work. His website, rbsdm.com. I use it every day. I had no idea what the letters stood for. I now understand they stand for RBs don't matter. Like, I did not know that. We had him on the podcast like 3 weeks ago.
Oh, that's hilarious.
And I was like, oh my God. It was like one of those gifts, like the gift from The Wire, where he's like, damn. I would say I want to say hysterical, maybe. I want a word that means like crazy. Like that's I really want to like Looney. Looney's a good one. Like anywhere that man I could just go with crazy. I guess because Seahawks. Yeah, I'll go with crazy. Just keep it simple. Don't overthink. Seahawks Twitter is crazy because crazy can mean like you can be crazy good. You can be like an evil genius. Seahawks Twitter is this world that like if something gets momentum, the momentum, what they can do with the momentum, like let Russ cook. It's just like a little joke. I wrote the history on it. Like it's just a joke, and it turned into a thing, like a legit thing. Like I forget his real name right now, but Josh Cashman.
Josh Cashman, yeah, had him on this.
Yeah. Oh man, Cable Thanos. It's an amazing story. Like he got hired by the quarterback. Like he didn't just make funny videos and they were great. And no, man, the quarterback hired the dude. Like that is where else is that happening? Like that's just a totally different world that exists over here. And I say crazy because like we get like that. You weren't here for this, but like every time the O-line sucked, hashtag fire Bevel and fire Cable were just like things like stuff just gets wheels over here. And like Seahawks Twitter is this crazy, wonderful place where you can do this thing like we're doing now. And then people can tweet me like we should trade Russ for 1 million picks to the Jets and like Pete's too old. Let's get him out of here. Like there's craziness and then there's nuance. Like I think Seahawks fans really understand the nuances of the game really well. A lot more than other fan bases. Looking at you, NFC East fans. Like I give Seahawks fans a lot of credit. Like you got people who aren't like even credited people who are like aren't here every day, like at the VMAC, but like do great work.
Yeah.
Just from afar, like everyone at Hawk Blogger and like field goals, like like that's great stuff. And every team has blogs and stuff, but like. I'd be reading stuff like, oh man, this is great stuff.
I know.
You're like, no, this is fantastic. The content is good. I'm the inside jokes, the TJ Langs, the Kristen Michael jokes, and it's a good time. It gets frustrating at times, but like Seahawks Twitter is a very crazy place, and I mean that in a very good, heartwarming way.
I like it. That's a good answer, Mike. And really, I appreciate this. I think you do a fantastic job of blending facts with opinion in your pieces. And I got to listen more to the Seahawks Man-to-Man podcast that you do with Christopher Kidd. I really enjoyed listening to it today. Starting off with SpongeBob memes and we're moving on to pizza. Like you're speaking my language here. I really like that. So
yeah, man, thank you.
I can't wait for the piece that's probably coming about this mess. I assume that there's one on the way. And let's do this again, man. This was a blast.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me, Paul. Appreciate you.
No problem.